Hello and welcome back to Icon Diary. I'm Peter Blackwood. What did you get for Christmas? I got a little book from my sister-in-law. She sent it with the annual Christmas card. It's called Russian Icons by David Talbot Rice. David Talbot Rice has a doctorate of literature. He was the Watson Gordon Professor of the History of Art at Edinburgh University. I say he was because I assume by now he's dead. This was published, well, in the year I was born, 1947. So it's an oldish book, but it's also a little book and it has a number of plates in it. But he has written some interesting things about Russian and Byzantine icons in general, and he's written it for a Western audience, presumably a Scottish audience. He's written it in the middle of the last century. It's just after the war. We are still allies, or the British are still allies with Russia. It's before the Cold War. And he is talking to a Western audience who probably know more about Western art than about Byzantine art. So let me read some of this little book to you. My apologies for pronunciations, particularly of some of the artists who I only know from reading their names, not from hearing them. And look, I'll apologise about other things as we go along. But here is what David Talbot Rice has to say about Russian icons. To those who have not visited the museums of Greece and Russia, the name icon is generally associated with those small, stereotyped religious pictures usually depicting somewhat obscure saints, and as often as not covered not only with dirt and candle smoke, but also by metal covers which leave visible only the face and hands of the figures depicted. It is true that many later icons, both in Greece and Russia, were of this type, but these examples are no more characteristic of icon painting in its grand period than the hackwork landscapes of the decorators' shops of today are typical of English painting of the 18th century. In the case of icons, but before examining it, it will be best to orientate ourselves by trying to assess the place of Russian painting in the chronological and aesthetic perspectives of European painting. Probably the best known of all Russian icons is Andrei Rublev's painting, The Old Testament Trinity. Its subject, the three angels entertained by the hospitable Abraham and Sarah, is the illustration of a theme from the Old Testament. Its inward significance is, however, far greater. The three angels are symbolic of the Christian Trinity itself, and whereas the artist was at certain periods considered to be guilty of the greatest sin if he attempted to depict this subject, he was always free to depict scenes illustrating the Old Testament without restraint. Rublev was born about 1370 and died about 1430. His Old Testament Trinity was painted about 1410. At this time, Fra Angelica, he was 387 to 1, and Acello were working in Italy, and the Van Eycks were flourishing in the Flemish world. In this country, or as certain authorities would prefer it in France, the Wilton diptych in the National Gallery had been painted only a few years before Rublev's Trinity. It is usually dated between 1381 and 1394. These comparisons afford a milestone from which to measure the later development and earlier history of Russian painting. But in addition, they have quite a considerable aesthetic significance, for the works produced more or less contemporaneously in East and West at this age are not as unlike in superficial appearance or as far removed from one another in outlook and understanding as might at first be supposed. In the Wilton diptych we see something of the same pure brilliance of colour, the same underlying allegory and the same firm balance of composition as in Rublev's Trinity. The painters of both pictures must have had much in common, both as regards their artistic heritage and as regards their mental outlook. Both derived much from early Christian art in the Byzantine world, and in their outlook both show the same essentially religious understanding, based on the same simple Christian feelings. The master of the Wilton diptych, as well as Rublev, must have believed with sincere sincerity that Christian faith and everyday life went hand in hand with one another, and that to illustrate the tenets or records of the faith was the natural and normal task of the painter. Both artists are mainly concerned with the faith underlying the subject matter of their paintings, yet both are at the same time of this world. Both are realists rather than visionaries. In the work of Uccello, the same sense of reality and something of the same subtle blend of deep faith and the affairs of every day are again apparent. The subject matter of many of his paintings, unlike those of Rublev, was produced by contemporary secular events. The Rout of San Romano in the National Gallery is an example. But others dealt with religious themes, and it is these that show, perhaps more than the works of any other contemporary Italian painter, the blend of the ethereal and the mundane, which is the dominating character of the medieval world. Uccello's Crucifixion at Dusseldorf is as deeply religious in feeling as any work of the age. Every contour, every line, every rhythm of its composition goes to stress the immensity of the theme. Yet never is the theme divorced from the contemporary world, or Uccello's, into some visionary, imaginary realm of its own. The Van Eycks, again, though less subtle than Uccello, and more concerned with the details of everyday life, have everything of the same conception and associate the figures of the Bible story with the affairs of their own world without any sudden transposition. The two blend harmoniously together, and not only do the Christs or the Virgins of their paintings resemble closely the individuals met with in the Low Centuries at the time, in the Low Countries at the time, but also one feels the daily life of the models was based on the ideals and outlook of Christ, so that the two were to a great extent inseparable. With Fra Angelico, on the other hand, we find a more visionary conception. The figures seem divorced from the world. Each one of them, saint, martyr, even our Lord himself, is a recluse who sees life through monastic eyes. Never could these figures have understood the world in all its diverse aspects. Never could they have had more than superficialities in common with it. They might have experienced the trials and temptations of a hermit, a recluse, but never those of a man of the everyday world of the medieval age. At the first casual glance, it might seem that Rublev would take his place most naturally in the visionary world of Fra Angelico. But though contemporary details are entirely absent from his work, and scenes of everyday life are never illustrated, a close examination of his paintings show that he most definitely does not belong to that world of dreams and visions, isolated behind the high and closing walls of a monastery in which Fra Angelico thought and lived. Rublev, it is true, works in a narrow binding convention and is far less free than Uccello or even than the painter of the Wilton diptych. But beyond and beneath that convention, he belongs to this world, and his paintings are essentially a part of it. They could move one to faith, to enthusiasm, to action, but not to contemplation and reclusion. With Fra Angelico, there is almost an excess of piety. One tends to fall, as it were, into a whisper before them. With Uccello, Van Eyck or Rublev, no such constraint is experienced. In Rublev's work, there is a no less ardent religious faith, but it is vital and strong, with nothing of the almost shamefaced reverence that sometimes characterises the Christian church in the West. Nevertheless, resemblances exist between Fra Angelico's work and Rublev's, in colouring, in theme, and most of all, in iconography. The iconographical relationship is indeed perhaps stronger than in the case of Uccello's religious works, and certainly stronger than in that of Van Eyck. It is due to descent from a common ancestor and to that faithfulness to old models which is a dominating characteristic in Russian art, but which, though less obvious, is also of great importance in the West, especially in the products of a slightly earlier age than the one we are examining. The spread and later survival of Byzantine influence in the West is, however, a wide and complex subject which cannot be dealt with here. Its dissemination in Russia, on the other hand, is fundamental to our subject, and without some acquaintance with the basic elements of Byzantine art, its origins and its development, the study of Russian painting and architecture is impossible. In the art of the Byzantine world as a whole, two primary trends are to be observed: the Eastern, which was predominant in Syria and Anatolia, and the Hellenistic or Greek, which was in the force in the capital Constantinople and in parts of Western Asia Minor and in Greece itself. Both of these trends tend to be found in Russia also. The Greek characterised by a greater attention to elegance, delicacy and balance. The Eastern being more uncouth but perhaps more forceful and laying greater stress on inner meaning than on elegance or beauty. Of the two, the first is probably the more important. For just as Vladimir found the Russian state adopted Orthodox Christianity from Constantinople as the official religion in 988, and imported doctrine, priests and ritual alike, so he also took over Byzantine art as something more or less ready-made. Architects, craftsmen, mosaicists and painters were among the foremost of those who flocked from the Byzantine world to Vladimir's new capital in Kiev, and they were there welcomed with enthusiasm. The city's new cathedral was called St. Sophia after Justinian's edifice at Constantinople, the greatest church of Christendom. The plan of the new building at Kiev followed exactly a Byzantine model, and the mosaics with which it was adorned differed in no way from contemporary examples in the old Byzantine Empire, in lands which now belong to Greece and Turkey. The Kiev mosaics are as much of one kind than those of Delphi near Athens, or Nicaea near Constantinople, or of the Neomoni in Chios, as are those paintings in Gainsborough with those of Reynolds. Of the icons of this period, few are preserved. Indeed, there is only one really outstanding example that has survived, the famous Virgin of Vladimir. Its exact date is not known, but it is hardly to be assigned to the age of Vladimir, that is 980 to 1015. It is at least mid-11th century in date. In the absence of other panels, a comparison of the mosaics and wall paintings of the age suggests that it came from a Constantinopolitan and not a Russian workshop. It must have been taken from Constantinople to Kiev, probably early in the 12th century, but we know that in 1155 it was carried from Kiev to the city of Vladimir by the Grand Duke Andrei Bogolovsky, in order that its miraculous powers might be of benefit to that town. From there its renown spread, and it soon came to be reverenced as the holiest treasure of Russia, the wonder-working power of which was in repeated demand to bring protection in time of battle or to aid in averting natural catastrophes such as lack of rain. In the development of Russian art, it played a no less important role. It constituted the model for a whole series of copies throughout the following centuries, the most important of which is one attributed with a very degree of probability to the hand of Rublev. Moreover, it was responsible for the conception in much of Russian art of the Virgin and Child as an intimate, tender and delicate group with nothing of that awe-inspiring austerity which is met so often in the eastern part of the Byzantine world and sometimes even in early Italian painting. At the end of the 14th century, Our Lady of Vladimir was transferred to Moscow, and though it was at times taken elsewhere for short intervals, so that its power might be exercised for the benefit of other towns, its home was established there in the Cathedral of the Assumption till 1919, when its thorough examination and cleaning were undertaken. Numerous successive layers of repainting were removed, which has been added repeatedly, often very distinguished painters. Only the faces of the mother and child and certain details are actually to be assigned without doubt to the original work, but the general scheme has been preserved, and enough remains to show the glorious quality of this early painting. Its dignity and its tenderness are outstanding, and the delicate glory of the faces alone seems to distinguish it as one of the foremost religious paintings of the Christian world. The iconographical type of this painting was one well known in the Byzantine world, though no other panels of as early a date as the Vladimir icon are known. Mosaics and works in precious metals have survived from an even earlier age, which show it. The type is that known as Aliusa in Greek or Melania in Russian. Excuse the pronunciations, I'm sorry about that. That is to say, tenderness. The child looks up at his mother and presses his cheek against hers. This is the mother of tenderness icon. She's obviously preoccupied in her love for him, even though she gazes forwards and not at him. The conception is distinct, and the austere manner of certain Byzantine or later Russian works where the two figures become virtually monuments of adoration, wherein human affection and all-embracing love are allowed to play no part, is completely divorced from the conception that we see here. It was at one time held that this intimate conception was due to the Italian influence in Russian art. but researchers of the last 30 years or so show that a tender, compassionate understanding was by no means foreign to the Byzantine style. So where we see the conception in Russian or later Greek works, it must be attributed to Byzantine descent and not to influences from Renaissance Italy. Only at a much later date, when the development of Russian art has veered towards a more austere, rhythmical manner in the presence of intimacy and tenderness, sometimes to be attributed to influence from the West. But then the influence is a distinct one. The grandeur of the old models has disappeared, and in its place we see a sentimental or even sugary conception which may be well enough in the work of a Murillo, but which is little short of repulsive when it is only superficially assimilated upon a core to which it was basically inimical, as in Russia. I have read some more about David Talbot Rice. He was English, a graduate of Oxford University, and a field archaeologist that saw him working digs in Turkey and Cyprus and Asia Minor and Iraq and Iran. He wrote books on Byzantine and Islamic art. His scholarship was certainly hands-on rather than library-based. His wife, Tamara, was born in St. Petersburg, and she was also an art historian. Well, there we have a little of what Professor Albert Rice has to say about Russian icons. His colour photos do not include references that he makes to the Western art that he mentions. He assumes that his readers are familiar with collections in the National Gallery in London or books with photos of works of Fra Angelico and Uccello, etc. We, on the other hand, can just go online, as I have done, to retrieve some of the photos for this video. I'm certainly interested in the comparison that he makes between Rublev and his Western contemporaries, particularly interested in his disdain for sentimentality and how he compares that with depictions of tenderness and Eastern depictions of Our Lady of Vladimir. Well, I have found this little book interesting. I hope you have too, and thank you for watching.